All right, well, we're off to a great start. I turned the microphone off. It's now on, as you can tell. So, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us at this year's Words Fest. We're grateful that you've been brought here by some sort of curiosity or personality or concept, and in particular, we're grateful that you're joining us for Frankenstein's creature, Yes, Sir, That's My Baby. You can figure out the title for yourselves, I'm sure. My name is Adam Furnell, and I've been a volunteer at the festival for the last number of years. And I, like the rest of you, am looking forward to hearing from Dr. Stephen Bruhm this evening. He's going to be speaking to you about Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein in this its 200th year. Before we hear from Stephen, I just want to tell you a little bit about him, mostly things gleaned through Google and a short conversation with him prior to this talk today. Stephen's research career has taken him through a number of areas: romantic fiction, gothic aesthetics, queer narcissism, sexual children, dance. All of his projects are welded together by an interest in the body. Bodies in pain, bodies in pleasure, bodies in choreography, bodies in view. And all are sites of culture and perhaps extra-cultural meaning. He's been working on a book exploring how the body's reactions to pain come to frame choreographies of mortality, from the romantic ballet to Michael Jackson. He's taught courses at all levels of the undergraduate curriculum, as well as the graduate level. And among his many teaching credits, I was particularly intrigued by the way that he spoke about his time spent teaching children's literature in a recent lecture at the London Public Library. He has studied at Mount St. Vincent University, Dalhousie, and McGill, and taught for many years at Mount St. Vincent before joining us at Western. Additionally, he was the managing editor of Horror Studies, a journal for scholars interested in horror. Such a thing exists, and it's a wonderful thing that it does. And he did that for the last 6 years. You can find a list of his publications and his research interests at his website at stephenbroom.ca, and I mention that because he told me that he'd like to update it. So if the traffic starts to increase, perhaps that will happen. And just a brief anecdote from myself. As I was getting to know Stephen through some of his work, I came across a piece that he created for Western News on the anniversary of this 200th year of Frankenstein. And he does what many people feel like they have to do in this time, and he made a connection between Frankenstein and Donald Trump, Frankenstein and the White House. And I think that it's the kind of piece that we need in these times. It's a piece written with very, very significant precision, really incredibly strong language, and really precise thought. And it struck me that that allows us to think with nuance, to think with subtlety, and that perhaps in these times we need those nuances and subtleties more than ever. And so it was a great pleasure to read, and I suggest that you look it up. Trump plus Frankenstein plus Stephen plus Western will get it for you on Google, and I suggest that you do it. So finally, before I bring Stephen up, I want to tip you off to a secret. This is not a very big secret. It happens at talks like this. At the end of Stephen's remarks, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So prepare yourself mentally for the moment at the end of the talk when we say, if you have any questions. All right, without further ado, Dr. Stephen Bruhm.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam, and belated happy Halloween to you all. Adam mentioned my strong language. I think he meant forceful, not obscene. There won't be any obscene language in this talk, I promise. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is 200 years old. And what this means is not just that we seem never to tire of hearing this famous story, but that the we who hear it and read it in all kinds of different ways. There's a long history of different ways of receiving this novel for its meaning, its themes. Mary Shelley herself subtitled the novel The Modern Prometheus, and that, for her anyway, suggests that at the core of the novel is a concern with the sin of trying to steal the power of the gods, trying to steal the fire, which is the fire of knowledge from the gods that comes from the old myth of Prometheus. Only in this case, it's not the gods, it's the capital G God of the Christian Europe in the late 18th century. which is of course an act both of vanity and heresy. And literary historians have followed suit here, reading the novel not just for its roots in the myth of Prometheus, but also for how Mary Shelley is bringing up to date John Milton's famous poem, Paradise Lost, which is, of course, in the earlier chapters about, the earlier books, about Satan fighting back against his unfair father, God, who both made him powerful and then threw him out of heaven because he was powerful. That idea of poetry, of power, of words, and of taking fight and issue within words connects to the novel's moment of Genesis, or what we assume is the novel's moment of Genesis, which is when Mary Shelley was on holiday with her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron, Byron's lover, and his doctor. They were in the Villa Diodati on a lake in Italy when Mary, and they had this competition for telling ghost stories, who could tell the best ghost story, and Mary had a dream that night that then became the text for the novel Frankenstein. But what's important there, I think, is that both Shelley and Byron and many, many other poets, nobody here, but many, many other poets, understood that the poet is actually not equal to God, the poet is God, because the poet is what speaks the world into being. And somebody gets punished for that. Okay, another possible reading then from this Promethean story is that the novel is about the rise of science in the late 18th century and the dangerous uses to which science can be put. As we all know from the story, Victor Frankenstein creates a living being out of dead tissue, thus giving us what is probably the first mad scientist narrative. So coming from 1818 up through Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to the more contemporary Hannibal Lecter and the Human Centipede story films. And if you haven't yet seen any of the Human Centipede movies, don't, really don't. They're really bad. But in that line of thinking, Frankenstein stands as the first science fiction novel. Still, other readers have taken a feminist angle on the novel, that it condemns Victor's act of creation without benefit of procreation, which is to say, Victor creates a living creature without the participation of a woman as mother and wife, thus showing the disastrous consequences of a world where men are all-powerful and women are irrelevant. And this, I think, had something to do with what Adam was saying about my piece on toxic masculinity in the Trump era. And finally, not really, but finally, readers of this novel, including me, have also seen that world of sexual exclusivity of the relations of men in the absence of women to say something about the rise of homophobia and the persecution of gay desire at the beginning of the 19th century. Because Frankenstein is ultimately, primarily about men wanting the close and loving and bonded relationships and friendships with other men. And I don't know if you're familiar enough with the novel, you'll remember that we are told the story kind of in three layers. There's what's called the frame narrative of Captain Walton, who's trying to usher a ship through the North Pole and gets stuck on the ice. He picks off an ice floe, this lost and dying Victor Frankenstein, who is up there chasing the creature, and the novel is in kind of boxes whereby Captain Walton frames the story in letters to his sister, Margaret, back in London, and there recounts what Victor tells him. Victor recounts what the creature or the monster tells him in the center of the novel. So you get these kind of three layers, but each of those three men in their narrative talk about their driving desire to have another man who will understand them, who will completely sympathize with them, who will be their soulmate, their bosom buddy, and that only another man can do this, they claim, because they share the same sex. So women, who also in the novel have, of course, not the same kind of vaulted intellect, only a man can understand. So the novel has that feeling of a kind of homo bonding that it then persecutes because pretty much everybody fails or dies. But in that sense, then, the novel is also a kind of caution about being careful for what you wish for. Because I think if it's the case that Victor Frankenstein wants another male to completely understand how he feels and what he thinks, he gets it in the creature because the creature can terrorize him, because the creature knows all the time through the novel where Victor is, what he's thinking, what he's doing, and how he, the creature, can show up to terrorize him. So, you know, you might want somebody inside your head, or you might not. As I like to think of that story, hell hath no fury like a boyfriend scorned. Now, all of these readings fascinate me and have fascinated me as I've taught queer studies and Gothic studies like Frankenstein for the past 25 years. And I've been doing this since I earned my PhD at McGill in 1994. And I've always been interested particularly in how the Gothic novel, since the 1760s, takes what we understand to be our most culturally treasured desires and pleasures, the thing we want most, and to show us, quite mean-spiritedly, the dark side or the evil underpinnings of those desires. So if I can quote the old warhorse Sigmund Freud for a moment, Freud suggested that what we most fear is often what we most want. And I like reading the Gothic through that because I think it tells us something about ourselves. And to that end, I'm arguing that Frankenstein, in particular in the Gothic novel generally, is in great part about getting what you wish for and really regretting it. Now, the point of my talk today is to focus that on children. And the kind of theme that runs throughout this novel, and the theme that runs very much throughout our culture still in the early 21st century, that we want children, and we want those children to be perfect, to be beautiful, to be intelligent, to be physically strong and healthy, to be moral and kind, and to be independent and successful. And that, of course, is not a new wish. It's not a new hope. It's something that, you know, we can see in its various incarnations in literature, and certainly at least since the late part of the 18th century, which is the time when the Gothic novel was invented. And I like to think that as long as there's been a Gothic novel, there's been a Gothic child. In the very first Gothic novel, which is Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto from 1764, the first scene of the novel is this fantastically weird moment in which the 15-year-old son of Prince Manfred, Conrad, suddenly walks out into the courtyard of his castle, and a great big huge plumed helmet falls out of the sky and crushes him. There he is being crushed by the helmet. I mean, I know it happens all the time, but it's never explained why that happened. It's just, oh look, splat. And then following that, one of the most famous Gothic novels of the late 18th century was Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk, in which there's this really bad film version with Victor, what's his name, that was made a couple years ago. The monk is this sort of evil tyrant, but what we come to understand, spoiler alert, through reading the book, is that Ambrosio, the monk, the main figure, was the product of a cross-class liaison between this, I believe it was a nobleman and a poor woman, and of course this couldn't happen. Not only were they unwed, but they were of different classes. So this little baby is shipped off to a monastery, and a monastery in Spain under the understanding of really Catholic-phobic British people is you turn into a rapist and a killer and a monster. So that's the child we see in Ambrosio, in the monk. And then, of course, from there, we get a whole panoply of late 20th century Gothic children, a prize for anybody who can identify all of them. Now, some of these Gothic children are actually born evil. In fact, except for Regan MacNeil from the Exorcist and those two up there, all those guys seem to have been born evil. Some of them start off innocent and become evil. That would be your Regan MacNeil and The Exorcist. And still others, the ones looking really bad, are monsters or devils in disguise. They're not children at all. They're what I like to call counterfeit children. Okay, what does this mean for Shelley's novel? Well, Shelley referred to her novel as her, quote, hideous progeny, as if it was a kind of monstrous child itself, the book, about a child that is perceived to be monstrous. And one of the things that makes the creature such a monstrous figure is the comparison we get between him and some of the other children in the book. The book is fascinated by the representation of other kids, and I'm going to argue that that matters, because the other kids are, it would seem by definition, beautiful, angelic, all those things that I listed that we want our children to be. Now, the first child we meet is named Elizabeth Lavenza, and she's going to grow up to become Victor's wife. This is not a good move for her, as you might imagine, but we first see her as a little girl. And in the 1818 version of Shelley's Frankenstein, Elizabeth is the cousin of Victor, whose mother has died. They live in Italy, and her mother has died. And so her father, the father writes a letter to Victor's father and says, I don't want to take care of this girl. It's the kind of first of the deadbeat dad syndrome in this novel. I don't want her, you come take her. And so Elizabeth is adopted by the Frankenstein family, and she gets this description. Victor says, I've often heard my mother say that she was at the time, Elizabeth, the most beautiful child she had ever seen, and showed signs even then of a gentle and affectionate disposition. These indications and a desire to bind as closely as possible the ties of domestic love determined my mother to consider Elizabeth as my future wife. So kind of sort of an arranged marriage almost. From this time, Elizabeth Lavenza became my playfellow, and as we grew older, my friend. While I admired her understanding and her fancy, the word for imagination, I loved to tend on her as I should on a favorite animal, and I never saw so much grace, both of person, which is to say body, and mind, united to so little pretension. Okay, here you have the kind of definition of the perfect Gothic heroine, the woman who is going to probably meet her death or get really rich at the end of a Gothic novel, depending on which novel you're reading. But it's also a description of a certain kind of child. And what interests me here is, just to be very brief about a history of childhood, many of you may know that prior to the so-called Age of Reason in the 17th and 18th century in Europe, children were viewed as kind of miniature adults. If you look at medieval paintings with children in them, these little tiny babies have 35-year-old faces, but they're just kind of shrunken. Or they are the products, especially in Christian cultures, of original sin, of the sin of Adam and Eve at birth, so that children are born already fallen, already corrupt, already evil. And it was in the 17th century, this is a really gross generalization, but in the 17th century with the writings of a person like John Locke, that children were removed from being born into original sin and were made more blank slates. They're not good, they're not bad, they're not nothing. They are made by the experiences that they will undergo. And then as we move up through the 18th century toward the turn of the 19th, we have a figure like Jean-Jacques Rousseau saying children are blank slates, but they're kind of backlit with this fundamental goodness. A child raised in nature by good parents or tutors and left to their own devices will turn out to be good people and good citizens. So that's the good news for children, but there's something, you know, when Victor says, I doted on her, I loved to tend on her as I should a favorite animal. When Shelley revised the novel for the final publication in 1831, she upped the ante on our Elizabeth. Now, first of all, Elizabeth is no longer a cousin, so we get rid of that suggestion that there might be something strangely incestuous here. She's rather a child that his mother found in a hovel in Italy. And we get this description. Elizabeth's hair was the brightest living gold, and despite the poverty of her clothing, seemed to set a crown of distinction on her head. None could behold her without looking on her as a distinct species, being heaven-sent and bearing a celestial stamp in all her features. On the evening previous to my being, stop there. Okay, that's quite the job description for a little girl, because basically she is heaven-sent. She is an angel, totally uncorrupted and uncorruptible, sent down from heaven to be a human being. And then, Victor adds, on the evening previous to her being brought to my home, I heard my mother said playfully, I have a little present for my Victor, tomorrow he shall have it. I looked upon Elizabeth as mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praises bestowed on her, I received as made to a possession of my own. So, enter male narcissism, enter male toxic masculinity, and exit the child as a real person with strengths and flaws to be this kind of angelic figure that is in no way human. This is not the only description. We have another child, William, Victor's youngest brother, who is described in many of the same kind of ways. Quote, little darling William with sweet, laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curling hair, that sweet child whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle and yet so gay. I mean, these children never wet the bed. They never burp. They are too good to be true. So the novel uses repeatedly this cultural literary convention that portrays children as the perfect angels directly sent from heaven. So when we think about Frankenstein's creature, about the being that Victor made, we think, okay, that's the direct opposite of this. Not quite. Victor, as you know, if you've read the novel or if you've seen Boris Karloff or Peter Boyle or whoever, Frankenstein's creature is like 8 feet tall and this big. That wasn't the original plan. Victor had originally intended to build a living being out of dead body parts. That would be a tiny little baby. But as he put it, the minuteness of parts formed a hindrance to my speed, so I made him 8 feet tall instead. In other words, working on this little body was not going to work because I had a deadline to meet. But the same kind of perfection was the goal. He says, quote, his limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, exclamation mark. His hair was of a lustrous black, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. So it's no wonder then that when you put this beautiful being together and then you step back and see the whole figure, which unfortunately has, quote, watery eyes in dun white sockets, yellowed skin, and a shriveled complexion, it's little wonder then that you run screaming from the room and you want nothing more to do with this figure, which is the whole plot turn in the novel Frankenstein. It's that Victor has made himself a son whom he then finds hideous and leaves and throws him away, leaves him to wander on his own and to make his life the best he can. Victor wanted the perfect child, and he couldn't bear the fact that the child he actually got, that he made, was imperfect, and things then spiraled down from there. So what I'm doing here is I'm reading the novel as fundamentally as a study in the kind of wish for a certain kind of offspring that will guarantee your own sort of, possession of beauty and praise and strength, that will guarantee your immortality. Your children are supposed to outlive you and they will take you into the future. But that will also be a tribute to Victor's scientific prowess, because he was able to do this where nobody else has able to make a child without sexual procreation, where nobody else has been able to do. Okay, so it's against the background, I think, of the imagined perfect child that the creature, who eventually gets to be called the monster, is placed, and how we can read it as a kind of, as I say, underside of the thesis that children are supposed to be our cultural life force. Here it would almost seem that children are a death force. But not just the ones who turn out to be quote unquote monstrous in the terms of the novel. Let's go back again to Elizabeth for a moment, because Elizabeth when she was a little kid, she played a very important role in a particular family dynamic. When she was very young, she contracted scarlet fever. Young girls in Gothic novels are always contracting almost fatal diseases, and they either live or they don't. She lives, she gets through it, even though they think she's going to die. But Caroline, Victor's mother, who adores her and is a good mother, was caring for her and nursed her through the scarlet fever, such that Caroline, Victor's mother, caught the scarlet fever herself and died from it. So there's a certain kind of psychologic in this novel where being a good, because she was a good mother to Elizabeth, that Victor's own mother perishes. And this is actually, Elizabeth has a track record here, because this is the second time this has happened. When Elizabeth was born, her own biological mother died giving childbirth. And if you know anything of Mary Shelley's biography, you know that she was the daughter of the famous feminist philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, who herself died a month after Mary's birth due to complications, sepsis, I believe, from the delivery. So there is a kind of through line in Shelley's story that children kill their parents, and they do so out of the parents' loving of the children. And I call this a psychologic because I think it matters to Victor more than he admits. He never says, Elizabeth was responsible for the death of my mother, but he also never forgets it. The minute he is finished making his creature and, gives them the jumper cables and the creature is alive, he does what any of us who are, going to make a creature out of dead party parts would do. He goes out of the room and has a lie down. He's exhausted, so he needs a nap. And during that nap, he has a dream. And this is what happens in his dream. I slept, he said, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health walking the streets of Ingolstadt, which is where he's working, where he's living at the university. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. Isn't it charming? And in case we don't get the connection yet, I held a shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I started from my sleep with horror when, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster I had created, looking at me from up through the skylight. So the connection indelibly in Victor's mind seems to be Elizabeth as child equals my mother as dead equals the creature that I have made, the miserable wretch I had created. And so love and parenting and death are all tied together in this novel in ways that I think cut two ways. Your children can be deadly to you because you haven't loved them enough, or your children can be deadly to you because you have loved them too much. And if any mothers would like to put their hands up. No, you don't have to. It's okay. Oops, sorry. Page switch. Okay. And again, it's worth keeping in mind that one of the biographical things, very sad things that's informing Shelley's novel is that while the novel was written and published in 1818, she and Percy had conceived a child in 1816, a daughter who was born prematurely and didn't survive. She was stillborn. So it was already on Shelley's mind that there's a certain connection between the maternal and death. And then in 1819, the year after the publication of the novel, a novel which Mary Shelley was then going to revise and publish again, in 1819, Percy and Mary lost their second child, a little guy named William. I think it's only coincidence that it's the same name as the brother in the book whom the creature kills. But they lost William, who died from malaria. So a lot of that is happening that I think Shelley is trying to make some sense of in the book, in a kind of twisted logic that children who are supposed to equal life actually equal death. And that equation provides the reason for the way the rest of the novel turns out. The creature, as you may remember, doesn't kill Victor. In fact, quite cruelly, he refuses to kill Victor, even though he's chasing him all across the European countryside. The only people that the creature kills are Victor's family, the people that are most loved by him. William, his friend Henry Clearville, and of course, eventually on their wedding night, his wife Elizabeth. So being loved by Victor Frankenstein is kind of the seal of death for you, because it means that the creature is after you and will kill you. But then the final point I want to talk about is that there is a way out of this in the plot, and that's when the creature says, you know, look, you made me, you abandoned me, you didn't give me the family I wanted. I want you to make me a wife, I want you to make me a bride, I want you to make me a soulmate, the way you are going to have one in Elizabeth. And if you do that, he says, I will leave you alone. I will leave Europe. I will go off and live. He actually says, I will go off and live in the desert of the Americas. Oops, wrong slide. There. So Victor embarks on the plan. He starts making the Bride of Frankenstein, but just before he finishes, he stops. And he thinks that, okay, he promises that he may love the wife, but what if the wife doesn't love him back? What if she leaves him? He's going to be really angry, and the anger will be disastrous and deadly for lots of people. She's going to be really angry. Her anger is going to be deadly for a lot of people. But then he really cuts to the chase in his own logic and thinks this. Even if they were to leave Europe and inhabit the deserts of the New World, yet one of the first results of those sympathies for which the demon thirsted would be children. And a race of devils would be propagated upon the earth who might make the very existence of the species of man a condition precarious and full of terror. Now just think that this basically kind-hearted creature who was driven to crime by Victor wants a wife, wants a family, wants to retire with them, probably wants children, but Victor's immediate assumption is if they're children, they will be as evil as the parents, even though the parents, there's no guarantee from their, quote, birth that they would be anything but good and kind. So he rips up the body, that he stops making the creature, and actually, in a really grotesque scene, destroys the figure. The creature has seen him through the window and says, I will get you for this, and then does, but does so in the terms, again, pulling on Paradise Lost, that have to do with the father and the son. The creature says to him, remember that I am thy creature, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good, misery made me a fiend, make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. And of course, that's ultimately what Victor refuses him to do. So, the creature gives, I think, the culturally familiar narrative that happy families make good children, and good children make happy families and great cultures and a great political life. But I'm suggesting then in closing that Mary Shelley herself was not so sure, and she makes that thesis not so certain in the novel. Children are complicated beings, I understand, and their less angelic sides may show themselves more often than we would like to expect, or that we get represented in this book. And that moreover, this demonic side might be something that we as parents have instilled or created, or it might be more the angelic, virtuous aspect of us loving our kids, loving our families too much. Love is the family, but in this novel, love also kills. And the children whom we want to be independent can stake out their independence in the way the creature does, and that's going to be at our expense. So I think it's both fitting and ironic that Mary Shelley's hideous progeny of a novel has survived and is still being talked about for 200 years, because the novel ultimately is about the fantasy of securing our immortality through our children, but it also shows us that it's our children who are most likely to kill us. Thank you.
It's that time. I could start us off with a question, but if there's one right here, I think you should start us off.
You said that, so he destroyed the bride. The
Yes,
bride.
yes.
In the film adaptations, so that's all fantasy then?
Oh,
Philip
yes,
Morris.
yes,
Okay.
yes. No, the original James Whale, Boris Karloff, has so little to do with the novel, just so little to do with the novel, and not in good ways. So yes, that the whole kind of Elsa Lanchester, where is she? She's so great. Yeah. Or Madeline Kahn from Young Frankenstein, who's even greater. That's a Hollywood invention.
The one with, what is his name? There's a British one.
Not Ken Russell, I hope. Oh, Kenneth Branagh.
Kenneth Branagh.
Yes, yes.
That's all. Okay, thank you.
No, Hollywood did very well with The Bride That Never Existed.
Why do you think Shelley never named the creature?
Sorry?
Why do you think Shelley never chose to name the creature?
I think the question would be, who would name him? I mean, one of the things that, students are always fascinated by when they read it, because they had no idea this was coming, is that when Victor abandons him upon his creation, he goes off into the world unable to speak, unable to read, unable to rationalize, because even though he has a body that works, his brain doesn't. And so he learns the language and he learns the culture through hearing other people speak or through hearing them read Paradise Lost, Goethe's Faust, a few other novels. So there's never anyone close enough to the creature's existence to actually give him a name other than "you monstrous wretch" or "you abhorrent murderer." So I think that's it. That naming is, of course, an act of affection in some ways. It's an act of bestowing identity. And the creature has no loving figure on which to bestow upon him, an identity. The one real human relationship he does have with a creature, with a guy who's named DeLacy, works for a little while because DeLacy is blind. So he can't see the hideous face that, again, Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein does a scream of a parody of that, but it has to do with the only person who can love me or care about me is someone who can't see me. But yeah, I think that's why.
But does he actually compare himself to Adam in that
Yes,
passage?
yes.
Right.
Again, because he's learned so much of the world through literature, through overhearing, which is how he learns to speak, how he learns the language. He hears literature being read, and one of the things that's read to him is Paradise Lost. So, Tunji.
Yeah, I was wondering, so I've seen lots of references. I mean, at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about how the Gothic is about this hidden fears. What do you say? You said it so well. What we fear most is what we want.
What we desire, yes, what we fear most is also what we desire. What we desire most is often what we fear.
Okay, so the question then is about the queerness of the Gothic,
Mhm.
in particular, if there's how you read that into Frankenstein.
Right.
Because I've been seeing a lot of references to Gothic fiction in queer African writing, purposefully writing, and I wonder where that was coming from, and if there's any of that.
Yeah. The best person on that, and no surprise, is the now late critic Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, where in her work on the Gothic, she talked about how the Gothic novel, especially, but not solely, in the late 18th and early 19th century, established as its primary scene, she said, two men in the clench of will and desire, by which she meant that there seems to be always this figuring of a quote-unquote good man or innocent or vulnerable man being persecuted, being followed, and being known too well by another man. So whether it's in Frankenstein or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Hannibal or the Confessions of a Justified Sinner, and those relationships between men are talked about in a kind of the same kind of erotic language that is often talked about with heterosexual couples, where the kind of sentimental version of the best marriage in the late 18th century and on is not one for money, it's one where you're sympathetic soulmates. And what happens if your sympathetic soulmate is another man? You panic, because in England, you can still be hanged for that. And in fact, if I recall, it was 1749 was the first instance of somebody in England, 1749, which is less than 20 years before the first Gothic novel, there was the first instance of a man being hanged in England, not because he committed what we would call homosexual acts, but because he had homosexual desires. And Cedric makes a lot about how it's not just behaviors that start to become really fearful. If you do this, you'll be killed. It's if you feel this, if you think this, you're in danger. Well, how does anybody know if you're thinking it unless they are your soulmate? Yes.
How does religion figure
Into this one? In a certain way, less so than some of the other Gothics, because a lot of the Gothic novels in Britain are set in Roman Catholic countries because it was a way of the Protestants trying to show how awful and barbarous Roman Catholic practices were. In this novel, there's a kind of assumption that this crime against nature that he's committing in making this creature is also a crime against God, and there will be a lot of references to God's displeasure and God's anger, but it doesn't have the same kind of religious thrust that, say, Lewis's novel, The Monk. I mean, what those nuns and monks get up to in Lewis's novel are just the most horrendous things that you can imagine, because it's a way of trying to belittle or demean the religion. That's less so in Frankenstein, not least because most of the action takes place in Protestant countries, Germany, Switzerland, so it doesn't have quite the same edge in that way. Just the kind of moral hubris or heresy of pretending to be God.
I don't know quite how to word my question, but I'm wondering about Mary Shelley as a female author writing about, and then those boxes you talked about, which were men talking to men, talking to men.
Yeah.
Does she get like male narrative and perspective correct, or can you tell a woman wrote this, she's not getting it right? I don't know how to ask that, but
When the novel was first published, under her name, I believe the first edition, if Josh Lombier is here, he probably knows. I think it was under her name, but people assumed that Percy wrote it. Percy had knocked off a couple Gothic novels himself. He was primarily known as a poet, but he had knocked off a couple Gothic novels that were awful, and you just don't remember them anymore. But, I mean, I don't want to say that she gets the male voice correct, because I don't know what the male voice is, especially the male voice in fiction in 1818. But figures like Elizabeth, like the women in the novel generally are all too good to be true, and so eventually they're not, and they die. The one figure that becomes really fascinating and that we don't know what to do with is the figure of Margaret, who is the sister back in London who's receiving all of Captain Walton's letters telling all this, and presumably we have this novel because Margaret published it, put it all together and published it as a novel. I mean, that's the fiction of the novel, right? So in terms of gender, I mean, I think the condemnation of the sheer masculinity of this is something that Shelley doesn't think anybody needs to point out more than it's kind of obvious in the text. But in a lot of her other works, a lot of her later works, they are about female protagonists. They are about female communities. And what Mary Shelley often gets talked about within is a kind of tradition of the female Gothic, whose most famous originator, practitioner was Anne Radcliffe, so the Mysteries of Udolpho and that stream, which had a lot more to do. The female Gothic usually has, as its characteristics, a lot of domestic strife. It's usually heroines trapped in castles by awful men who are going to die, and they're going to end up inheriting a lot of money and a hot guy. So that's the way a lot of female Gothic spins out, but Mary Shelley's novel isn't like that. Female Gothic will also often not have the supernatural stuff. Like, people are evil because they're greedy, not because they're fallen angels from God, whereas the men really let rip on demonic possession and that kind of stuff, or, you know, creating a figure, a new figure out of dead parts. So that's a long-winded answer, but for a novel written by a woman, it's very much about men and a critique of that, of men.
Sure, that's great. All right, so if you could join me in thanking Dr. Stephen Bruhm.
Thank you.